Hello everybody, and welcome to Theology 101. Welcome to our Friday series where we are going over pictures of faith from Hebrews chapter 11. Today we will look at the story of when Abraham was tested to sacrifice Isaac. Remember, Abraham didn't have a son for a long time, but God finally gave Abraham and Sarah a son named Isaac at the ripe old age of 190. So you can imagine how much Abraham loved Isaac. Waiting for all those years finally paid off until we get to Genesis chapter 22. God will test Abraham's faith. This is a necessary test because Abraham's faith has been shaky so far. Instead of leaving his father and going to the promised land immediately, Abraham settled in Haran and waited until his father died. Instead of trusting in God's protection, Abraham lied twice about Sarah in order to save his own life. To call Abraham the father of faith at this point is not an accurate description. It would be like calling kale the most delicious food in the world. So why is Abraham called the father of faith? It is because of Genesis chapter 22. By faith, Abraham, when he was tested, offered up Isaac, and he who had received the promises was in the act of offering up his only son. Let's zoom in on Genesis 22. After Sarah nursed Isaac, they stayed in the land of the Philistines for many years. Then the test comes in Genesis 22. So Isaac is not a little boy when we get to this point, but probably a teenager or maybe even older. Abraham is old, Sarah is going to die soon, and their son Isaac is ready to become the promised heir from Genesis 12. And then one morning, Abraham's world will crumble like a sandcastle hit by a wave. After these things, God tested Abraham and said to him, "Abraham," and he said, "Here I am." He said, "Take your son, your only son Isaac, whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah, and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains of which I shall tell you." With every single syllable, Abraham's hope and joy is being shattered. Take your son, not Ishmael, but the son that you love, the one you have waited for. Take Isaac and go to a mountain and burn him as an offering. This is a strange request, since only pagan gods will require child sacrifice. But the true God has never asked for human sacrifice. So you can imagine all the mixed emotions swirling in Abraham's mind. We see how Abraham responds. So Abraham rose early in the morning, saddled his donkey, and took 2 of his young men with him and his son Isaac. And he cut the wood for the burnt offering and arose, and went to the place of which God had told him. On the 3rd day, Abraham lifted up his eyes and saw the place from afar. After 3 days of wrestling with this test, Abraham determines that he will do what God commands, even if it kills his heart. Isaac really had been dead for 3 days in Abraham's mind by the time he goes up to Mount Moriah. When Abraham reaches the mountaintop with Isaac, we see the account slow down and we see a lot of details to give us a vivid picture. And Abraham took the wood of the burnt offering and laid it on Isaac his son. And he took in his hand the fire and the knife. So they went both of them together. You can now picture the scene. Abraham left his servants behind to wait for him, and now it is just him and his beloved son Isaac. Isaac has no idea what is coming. We see that they prepare the fire and the wood, but Isaac is wondering what they are going to offer God as an act of worship. At this point, you could probably hear the change in Abraham's voice. He doesn't want Isaac to know what he is going to do because he speaks generically. Abraham said, "God will provide for himself the lamb for a burnt offering, my son." So they went, both of them together. When they finally arrived at the place where Abraham was supposed to sacrifice Isaac, the time has come. Although we know that Abraham has every intention on sacrificing Isaac, it's not like he was in any rush to do so or that he wanted to kill his son. And instead of fighting back, Isaac willingly trusts in his father. Then Abraham lifts his knife, and in slow motion we see this happening. That Abraham reached out his hand and took the knife to slaughter his son. Isaac realizes that he is the sacrifice, and he probably cries out to his father in fear, but Abraham, with the knife in his hand, has to ignore his son's cries. This is what Abraham has been preparing himself to do for the past 3 days. And in an unbelievable act of faith, Abraham grabs the knife and is about to kill his son until God stops him and provides a ram as a substitute. So we see that Abraham passes the test. He is willing to sacrifice who he loves most for God, so God responds and saves Isaac from death with the substitute. But you might be wondering, how did Abraham pass this test? This is the same guy who laughed at God's promise for his son. The author of Hebrew tells us how Abraham was able to pass this test. He considered that God was able to raise him from the dead, from which, figuratively speaking, he did receive him back. Abraham concluded that if he obeyed God's command, that God could still fulfill his promise to create a nation through him because God is powerful enough to raise Isaac from the dead. In other words, Abraham believed in the resurrection. And before you think the author of Hebrews is reading into the text of Genesis 22, I want to go back to one detail that shows us Abraham passed the test because he believed in the resurrection. Look at what Abraham told his servants before he goes up the mountain. Then Abraham said to his young men, "Stay here with the donkey. I and the boy will go over there and worship and come again to you." Did Abraham not intend on sacrificing Isaac? We know the author of Hebrew uses the perfect tense for the verb offered, which means that Abraham completely offered Isaac. So we know Abraham did intend on killing him. However, why would Abraham expect to return with Isaac? It is because he believed that God has the power to resurrect Isaac from the dead. However, there's one more detail that will show us how much Abraham believed in the resurrection to do the impossible. Before the test, notice the phrase "they went both of them together." After the test, it is as if Isaac has vanished from the text. So Abraham returned to his young men, and they arose and went together to Beersheba, and Abraham lived at Beersheba. Where is Isaac? In fact, we don't ever see Abraham and Isaac together. Do you notice a glaring omission at Sarah's death? And Sarah died at Kiriath Arba, that is Hebron, in the land of Canaan, and Abraham went in to mourn for Sarah and to weep for her. Where is Isaac? In fact, the only time we see Abraham and Isaac together after this test is at Abraham's funeral. Abraham breathed his last and died in a good old age, an old man and full of years, and was gathered to his people. Isaac and Ishmael, his sons, buried him in the cave in Machpelah. Why don't we see Abraham and Isaac together after this test? Because Abraham figuratively killed Isaac in his heart that day, and even though God spared Isaac, Abraham lived as if Isaac was dead to him. In other words, Abraham chose God above his own son, whom he loved. Yes, Abraham didn't plunge a knife into Isaac, but he did in his heart, and he lived the rest of his life as if Isaac were dead. Why was Abraham willing to do this? It was not because he stopped loving Isaac. It was because he believed in the resurrection. He believed that God could raise Isaac from the dead, and that he would see Isaac again after his death. And this will mean that he would not need to hold on to him during his life. It was Abraham's faith in the resurrection that allowed him to do the impossible, surrender his son, and trust in God. If you want to study more about Hebrews 11, I'll leave a link to a recommended resource in the description box below. If you missed the last video about the desire of faith, I'll leave a link here for you to watch. Until next time, see you.